She should have been more careful. That's what he said, right after he tipped an entire bottle of red wine down the front of my daughter's dress. It was no accident. I watched his hand slow, deliberate, steady, because he knew exactly what he was doing. The wine spilled across the chest of her pale gray dress like a wound opening up. Then he said it a second time, even slower, like a man pressing his thumb into a bruise just to see if it still hurts. The whole room went dead silent. 30 people. My daughter's friends, the groomsmen, both families, all of them sitting there on the very night before her wedding, and not one of them dared to breathe. My daughter sat frozen in her chair, both hands gripping the edge of the table. And the man sitting beside her, the man who in just 14 hours would become her husband, didn't move. He just stared down at his plate, as if some invisible magnet were holding him there. The man who had just poured wine on my daughter's dress was the groom's father, a wealthy man used to the whole world bowing before him. From the very first time he met me, in his eyes I was nothing but a poor retired old man, a lowly civil servant who drove a beat-up car and got $20 haircuts, someone easy to ignore. In that room, he believed he had just humiliated a family with no one strong enough to stand up and defend it. He believed his money made him untouchable. He was wrong. I set down my glass of water. I didn't say a word. I simply stood up and walked out into the hallway to make 2 phone calls. 2 calls that would burn to the ground everything he had ever built. My name is Harold. I'm 64 years old, and I live alone in a narrow 2-story house in the Montevilla neighborhood of Portland, Oregon, on a street where the maple roots have buckled the sidewalk into little hills. It's the same house where I raised my daughter by myself, after I lost her mother to a long illness that took everything except her dignity. The back porch sags. There's a water stain on the upstairs ceiling shaped like Oregon, which I've always found funny. I drive a 2013 Subaru with 200,000 miles on it and a heater that only works if you hit the dash twice. I own 4 shirts I actually like and wear them in rotation without shame. I get my hair cut at a shop on Stark Street that still charges $20, because the barber and I have known each other longer than some marriages last. People look at me and see a tired old man, a retired civil servant maybe, somebody's quiet grandfather, easy to overlook. That has never once bothered me. I spent my whole career being underestimated by men who thought a soft voice meant a soft mind. They were wrong. I never needed them to know it. My daughter is named Renata. She's 32. She has her mother's wide, calm eyes and a laugh that arrives a half-second late, like she's checking first whether the joke is kind. She spent 7 years working in community mental health administration, taking on caseloads and budgets that would break people twice her age, for a paycheck that never once matched what she gave. She is, without exaggeration, the most decent human being I have ever known. She deserved a partner who could see that decency and treat it like the rare thing it is. Whether she'd found that in the man she chose, I tried very hard to believe. His name was Owen. He was 35, a landscape architect at a firm downtown, and when they were dating, he seemed fine. More than fine. He brought my favorite pastries the first time he came for dinner. He asked thoughtful questions. But I noticed how often he checked his phone. I noticed he spoke about his own projects far more than he asked about hers. Small things. I told myself love is not a case I get to argue. I'd learned that lesson the hard way, years ago, and I wasn't going to forget it now. What I could not talk myself out of noticing was Owen's father. His name was Garrett, and for 2 decades he'd been assembling a commercial development empire across the Pacific Northwest shopping centers, office towers, the kind of glass and steel projects that get written up in regional business magazines with photographs of him standing with his arms crossed. He wore his money the way some men wear a strong cologne. You smelled it from across the room, and you were never permitted to forget it was there. He drove something German and expensive. He had a corner office on a high floor downtown, with windows on 2 sides, and I know that because he told me within the first 5 minutes of meeting me. He didn't ask my name twice. He didn't need to. He'd already filed me. The first time I met Garrett was at a dinner Renata arranged about 9 months before the wedding. He picked the restaurant. The menu had no prices, which I've always thought of as a small piece of theater, a way of telling you that if you have to think about it, you don't belong. He shook my hand and looked me over with the unhurried assessment of a man appraising a used appliance. He asked what I did. I said I was retired. He asked from what. I said public service. He nodded the way people nod when they've already stopped listening and are waiting for the silence so they can talk again. Over dinner he talked about a development he was closing in Bend, a waterfront parcel in Tacoma that was going to be, his word, visionary. He used that word 5 times. I counted, because counting is what I do when I'm reading someone. Renata pressed her foot against mine under the table, a small private signal we'd had since she was a teenager, that meant, please be patient. I love you, I know. I smiled. I ate my fish. I said very little. On the drive home that night, I thought about what I'd seen in his eyes. It wasn't rudeness exactly. Rudeness requires you to register a person enough to be rude to them. This was quieter. It was indifference. The very particular indifference of a man who has divided the human race into people worth his attention and people who aren't, and who decided long ago that the only thing separating the two groups is money. I had spent 28 years prosecuting men like Garrett, not always for the same crimes, but for the same quality of mind. I said nothing to my daughter. She was happy. The wedding was months away, and who was I, a suspicious old man with a sagging porch, to plant doubt in the middle of her joy? So I let it go. I told myself I was wrong. Then the rehearsal dinner happened. It was the Thursday evening before the wedding. Garrett had reserved and paid for a private room at a steakhouse in the Pearl District, which I genuinely appreciated, even as I understood that generosity from men like him always arrives with an invisible invoice attached. There were maybe 30 people. Renata's friends, Owen's groomsmen, both families, and a few associates of Garrett's that no one introduced, and who watched the room the way auditors watch a ledger. I came with my younger sister Lorraine, who'd driven up from Eugene to be there. We were among the first of Renata's people to arrive. A server offered sparkling wine. I took a glass, and stood near the tall windows and watched the room fill. Garrett arrived last. I suspected that was deliberate. He swept in with his wife and 2 men I didn't recognize, still finishing a conversation that was clearly more important than the room he'd just entered. He gave Renata a brief hug. He shook his son's hand. He nodded at me from across the floor, the way you nod at a man whose name you can't quite retrieve. Dinner was at one long table. I was seated near the middle, beside my sister, across from one of the groomsmen. Garrett sat at the head, of course. Renata was placed near him, which I hoped was a gesture of welcome, and feared was a mistake. For the first hour it was fine, genuinely. Conversation moved easily. People told stories about the couple. A friend of Renata's gave a small toast that made my sister dab her eyes. I felt that cautious, breath-held happiness you feel when something you desperately want to go well actually seems to be going well. Then Garrett ordered a second bottle, and the performance began. It opened with a comment I wasn't supposed to hear, which meant I was absolutely meant to hear it. He was talking to one of his associates, his voice pitched just slightly too loud, about a fundraising gala he'd attended in Seattle. He named the venue. He named the silent auction items. And then, without once glancing in my direction, he said it was good for ordinary people to occasionally see how things were done at that level, even if they could never participate themselves. Nobody at the table reacted. I picked up my water and drank. A few minutes later, he turned to Renata the way a man turns when he wants an audience instead of a conversation. He said he'd been meaning to ask about her father. What exactly, he wondered aloud, did I do in public service? Renata looked at me, and I knew that look. It was the look of a woman who loves 2 people and can feel a collision coming that she has no power to stop. He was a federal prosecutor, she said, for 28 years. Garrett raised his eyebrows, the way people do when something surprises them far less than they're pretending. A prosecutor. Government work. He nodded slowly and said, "Good for you, Harold. Honest work." The way he said honest work settled in my chest like a cold stone. I smiled and thanked him. He told the table he imagined the government didn't pay much, that there was something noble about choosing service over success. My sister's fork made a small, sharp sound against her plate. Renata opened her mouth. I caught her eye, and gave the smallest shake of my head. She closed it. This was not the moment. I've spent my entire life knowing which moments are worth spending, and which are not, and this was not one I was going to waste. I knew how to read a room, so I waited. The moment came about 40 minutes later. Dessert had arrived. Owen was talking to a groomsman at the far end. I was speaking quietly with my sister about her drive up. Renata was telling a story to the woman on her left, laughing, finally relaxed. And then I heard Garrett's voice shift into that specific register that means a man is about to make a point he's proud of. He told the table what he'd said to his son when Owen first announced he was serious. He said he'd told the boy to learn the difference between sentiment and sense, between a woman who fits your life and a woman who merely fits your feelings. The table went quiet. Owen was looking at his plate. I'm going to pause here, because I want to tell you the truth about what was happening inside me. I have a temper. People who've only met the calm version of me never believe that, but it's real, and it's old, and I have spent 50 years building a wall around it, brick by brick. In that moment, every brick was hot. What I wanted was to stand up and tell this man exactly what 28 years of reading guilty faces had taught me to see in his. What I did was fold my hands on the table and breathe. He kept going. He said the family you marry into matters as much as the person, resources, networks, standing. He said those things travel down through generations and shape what's possible. I watched the happiness drain out of my daughter's face slowly, like water leaking from a cracked glass. His wife said his name, very softly. He wasn't finished. He said Renata was a lovely girl, and that word, girl, dropped into the room like something thrown from a roof. He said he had nothing against her personally, but he wanted his son to understand what he was walking into and what wasn't available to him. And then he looked directly at me and said that at a certain level of life, compatibility was about more than feelings, and surely I understood that. In my experience, I looked at him for a long, quiet moment. I said I understood a great many things about compatibility. Yes. He smiled the smile of a man who believes he's just won something. Then he reached for the bottle of red in front of him. Now slow down with me here, because this is the part I have replayed 1,000 times. He lifted the bottle. He meant, I think, to refill his own glass. Whether what happened next was the wine already in his blood, or genuine carelessness, or the simple contempt of a man who had stopped caring, whether his contempt was visible, I will never fully know, and it doesn't matter. The bottle tilted toward Renata, not toward her glass, toward her. The wine came down across the front of her dress. The whole room went silent. Renata sat perfectly still, the way people go still when they are deciding, in real time, whether they are going to cry in front of 30 people. The stain spread deep red against pale gray, soaking into the fabric of the dress she'd chosen for the night before her wedding. I could see her chest rising and falling, too fast. I could see her hands gripping the edge of the table. I could see the woman beside her freeze with a spoon halfway to her mouth. And Garrett looked down at the spreading wine, at my daughter's face, and he sighed, a small, almost bored sigh. He said, "Oh, Renata, you should have been more careful." And then again slower, like a man pressing a thumb into a bruise to see if it hurts. "You should have been more careful." I set down my glass. I looked at Owen, her fiancé, the man who in 14 hours was supposed to promise to stand between her and the worst of the world. He did not reach for a napkin. He did not say a single word. He looked at his father with an expression I can only describe as nervous. Not angry, not horrified, not protective, nervous. It was the face of a man who has spent his entire life managing his father's moods, and who was, right then, running the arithmetic of how much it would cost him to object. That was the moment I understood everything I needed to understand about the marriage. One of the groomsmen muttered something I couldn't catch. My sister made a sound that wasn't a word. And I stood up, not fast, not with the energy of a man about to make a scene. I stood up the way I used to rise in a courtroom, deliberately, without apology, the way you stand when the standing itself is the statement. I picked up my napkin. I walked around the table to my daughter. I placed the napkin gently in her hands, and I leaned down and said, quietly, just for her, "Go with your aunt to the restroom. Take all the time you need. I'm right here." She looked up at me, and her eyes were bright not with tears, but with the very specific fury of a woman humiliated in front of the exact people who were supposed to be celebrating her. "Dad," she started. "Go on, sweetheart," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." My sister rose and took her hand, and they walked out together. I turned back to the table. Garrett was already refilling his glass, unhurried, as though nothing of note had occurred. I said his name. He looked up. I said I wanted to be certain I understood what had just happened. I asked him, plainly, in front of everyone, whether he had just poured a glass of wine down my daughter's dress the night before her wedding, and then told her it was her fault. The room was very, very quiet. He met my eyes with the look of a man recalculating. He said it was an accident. The bottle slipped. These things happen at dinner. I repeated his words back to him slowly. The bottle slipped. "And then," I said, "you told her she should have been more careful." A beat passed. He said he may have misspoken. The associate beside him shifted in his chair and would not look at either of us. I held his gaze long enough for the silence to become a thing everyone in the room could physically feel. Then I said, "All right, enjoy your dessert." I walked back to my chair. I lifted my jacket from the back of it. I took my phone from the inside pocket, and I excused myself to the hallway, where I made 2 calls. I want to be honest with you about something. People hear this part and they imagine I was burning with the desire for revenge. I wasn't. Or not only that. What I felt, standing in that quiet hallway with the muffled sound of forks and forced conversation behind me, was something colder and clearer. It was the feeling I used to get right before I stood to deliver a closing argument. Not rage, focus. The kind of stillness that comes when you finally stop hoping a thing will be okay and start simply doing what needs to be done. The first call was to a man named Theo, who had been my investigator for nearly 12 years before I retired, and who had gone on to work as a senior compliance investigator in the financial fraud division of a federal agency. Theo and I had dinner a couple of times a year and talked more than that. He picked up on the second ring and asked why I was calling so late on a weeknight. I told him I needed a favor. Nothing official, just a question. I asked if the name Garrett, in commercial development out of Portland, meant anything to him. There was a pause. Not a long one. He asked where I was. I told him I was at the rehearsal dinner for my daughter's wedding, and that the man's son was marrying her in the morning. Another pause. Then he said, carefully, that he couldn't tell me what was or wasn't on his desk. I said I knew. He said the name I'd given him was not a name he was unfamiliar with. I leaned against the wall and let that sentence sit for a moment. I asked how long. He said he really couldn't. I asked for a ballpark. He was quiet, and then he said it wasn't a new file, and that we should leave it at that. I said all right. I thanked him. Before he hung up, he asked if my daughter was okay. I looked back toward the door of the dining room. She will be, I said. The second call was to a woman named Priya, a former colleague who now ran one of the larger civil litigation firms in the city. I'd mentored her when she was a young attorney, and she had one of the sharpest legal minds I'd encountered in a long career. She didn't answer, so I left a brief, even-toned message asking her to call me Monday morning about a possible civil matter I'd explain when we spoke. Then I went to check on my daughter. She was in the small lounge near the restrooms, where my sister had found her a club soda and was working at the stain with the calm efficiency of a woman who has handled worse. Renata had changed into a light cardigan she'd had in her bag. She looked steadier than I'd feared. She has her mother's composure, the kind that surfaces precisely when it's needed most. She asked how bad it was. I said the stain was being handled. Then I sat down beside her, and I told her I needed to ask her something, and that I needed her to be honest. Had Garrett done things like this before? Not necessarily the wine, but this kind of thing. Had Owen ever mentioned it? Had she seen it? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said he said things. At dinners, comments about money, about what Owen should be doing with his career. She said he'd once told Owen, right in front of her, that he was underperforming for a man of his background. She paused. Owen never pushes back, she said. He never pushes back. I asked if Garrett had ever spoken to her directly about the marriage. She looked at her hands and said he'd called her once, maybe 4 months earlier, to say he thought they were moving too fast, that Owen needed to think more carefully about his future. Polite, she said. But the meaning was clear. I asked what Owen said when she told him. She looked at me, and I understood. I took her hand and I told her the thing I most needed her to know. I said that whatever happened tomorrow, or after tomorrow, she needed to understand that I was in her corner completely. Did she understand that? She asked what I was going to do. I said I was going to do what I'd always done, let her make her own choices, but make absolutely certain she had every piece of information she needed to make them. She looked at me for a long moment. My daughter has her mother's eyes, and when she's working something out, they go very still and very clear. She said, "You already made a call, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. I said I made 2. She let out a breath that was almost, not quite, a laugh. We went back in. The rest of the evening passed the way evenings do when everyone has silently agreed not to mention the thing that just happened. Garrett was expansive and jovial. Owen made a toast that mentioned Renata twice and his father once. My sister drank her coffee and said nothing. I shook hands on the way out, and at the door, Garrett clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good man, Harold. Good man," like I'd passed some test he'd set for me. I told him to drive safe. The wedding happened the next day, and my daughter was radiant. She walked down the aisle in a different dress, not the one ruined the night before, but a backup she'd had the foresight to pack, because Renata is the kind of woman who plans for the contingencies that hope swears won't happen. I cried, which I had not done in public since the day we buried her mother. I danced with her to a song she chose, and I held on to her, and I thought about the 10,000 small, ordinary moments it had taken to get the two of us to that one. I said nothing to Garrett. I was cordial. I was pleasant. I was the quiet, retired man from Montevilla with the sagging porch and the cheap haircut and the car that needs the dashboard hit twice. If you've ever had to smile through an event while carrying something heavy and private inside you, if you've ever had to be gracious to a person who hurt someone you love, because the moment demanded it, and the people you love deserve the peace, then you know exactly what that wedding cost me, and exactly why I paid it gladly. On Monday, Priya called me at 7:45. I gave her the broad shape of it. She was quiet while I talked, and when I finished she said the thing I'd been circling. She said my daughter was now legally connected to this family. I said yes, as of Saturday. She told me to give her a week to look into the civil exposure, and warned that if a federal inquiry was already open, we'd have to be careful not to interfere with it. But she said there might be things Renata needed to understand about the structure of the family's assets, depending on how entangled Owen was. That was exactly what I was afraid of. I called my daughter that same day. I told her I had information developing that she needed to be aware of. I told her it concerned Garrett and possibly the business. I told her I wasn't certain yet and didn't want to alarm her, but that she had a right to know what I was looking into, and that she should be careful about signing anything connected to her father-in-law's company, and tell me immediately if Owen asked her to. She was quiet. She asked how serious. I said honestly that I didn't know yet, but that I wanted her eyes open. She said okay. I said okay. She trusted me. She always had. And here is something I've come to believe, deep in my bones, after a lifetime of it. Trust between a parent and a child isn't built in the enormous moments, the graduations, the weddings, the speeches. It's built in the 10,000 tiny ones, the promises kept, the patience held, the times you told the truth when a comfortable lie would have been easier. That's what trust is actually made of, and you cannot buy it, and you cannot fake it, and you cannot inherit it. Garrett would never understand that. He had a son who flinched when he walked into a room. I had a daughter who picked up the phone. Priya called back in 9 days, and the picture she'd assembled from public records and her firm's financial investigators was not a pretty one. Garrett's empire, built over 20 years, rested in significant part on misrepresented appraisals, undisclosed deals between entities he secretly controlled, and in several documented cases, what looked like outright fraud in loan applications to federally backed lenders. Theo had confirmed, without confirming, that an investigation had been active for well over a year, and Owen was listed as an officer of 2 of his father's subsidiary companies. He may not have known what those companies were truly being used for, but his name was on the paperwork. I drove to my daughter on a Thursday and took her to dinner, just the 2 of us, and I laid all of it out, not as a prosecutor, not as a man with a grievance. As her father, who had spent 28 years watching what happens to the people who drift into the orbit of men like Garrett and never see the danger until it's too late. She listened without interrupting. That's always been her way, with her hands around her water glass. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said Owen didn't know, or didn't know the whole picture. I said that might be true. I said it might also be that he'd told himself a version of things that let him not know. She looked at her glass and asked me what she should do. I said that was her decision, not mine, but that she needed her own independent counsel, who understood the full scope, and that Priya would represent her if she wanted. And then I told her the part that mattered most. I said Garrett was going to have a very hard road ahead of him no matter what she or I did, because the people investigating him had been building their case for over a year. I didn't start it. I didn't speed it up. I had only made sure that my daughter was not standing in the wrong place when it finally arrived. She looked out the window at the ordinary evening going by. Then she said quietly, "He poured wine on my dress." I said yes. And then he told me it was my fault. I said yes. She nodded slowly and said, Okay, Dad. Okay. She called Priya the next morning. Within 3 weeks, carefully and quietly, before anything became public, she had begun untangling her finances from Owens. She also began a series of conversations with him that I was never part of, because they were hers to have. I don't know everything that was said. I know my daughter asks the questions that need asking, and listens to the answers without looking away. 4 months after the wedding, Garrett was named in a federal civil complaint alleging wire fraud, bank fraud, and securities violations involving tens of millions of dollars across his subsidiaries. The complaint was meticulous, the kind of document that takes a very long time to build and a very short time to detonate. His attorney released a statement calling it baseless and politically motivated. I'd heard that exact statement many times over the years. It never ages well. 2 of his largest partners withdrew from pending projects within a week. A bank froze a construction account on a half-built development. His high-glass office became the subject of a court order restricting the movement of company assets. Owen was not named in the initial filing. Whether that stayed true depended on choices that were his to make, with his own attorney, and whatever was left of his relationship with his father. That was never a conversation I could have for him. She and Owen separated 7 months after the wedding. The specifics were theirs. What I know is that she called me the evening it happened, and that she was clear-eyed and steady, and that she said, "I need to know you'll let me be sad about this, without telling me it was the right decision." I told her, of course. I told her it probably was the right decision. She said, "I know." I said, "But you get to be sad first. Take all the time you need." And she did. And then, the way her mother would have, she got up and kept going. Garrett took a plea 19 months after the first filing. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. His assets fell under forfeiture, the properties, the accounts, the visionary deals in Bend and Tacoma, all of it pulled into the slow, thorough machinery of federal judgment. Priya sent me the sentencing notice with a single line. 11 years. Thought you'd want to know. I was at the barber shop on Stark Street when I read it. The same shop I've gone to for 20 years. My barber was cutting my hair, and we were talking about his granddaughter's birthday and the rain coming in off the coast. I read the message, and I set my phone on the little shelf under the mirror, and I looked at my own reflection for a moment. Old man. Sagging porch. $20 haircut. 200,000-mile car. I thought about Garrett clapping me on the shoulder in that doorway, saying, "Good man, Harold." I thought about the way he'd said honest work, with that little tilt of his voice meant to make me feel the smallness of the thing I'd chosen. And I thought about what that honest work had actually built. Not a fortune, not a firm, not a name in a business magazine, but a network of people, assembled over 28 unglamorous years, who knew my word was worth something, and who picked up the phone when I called, and a daughter who trusted me enough to listen. Garrett built a tower on a rotten foundation, and never once checked whether the ground beneath it would hold. I knew that story. I'd told a version of it to juries more times than I can count. The names changed, and the numbers changed, and the particular machinery of the fraud changed, but the shape was always the same. Arrogance is not intelligence. Power is not wisdom. And the man who dismisses you for what he can see has never once prepared for what he can't. This story taught me something I want to leave you with. The mistake almost everyone makes is believing that the loudest person in the room is the most powerful one. They're usually just the most frightened. What my daughter understood, that nobody else at that table did, was that the people genuinely worth marrying into are the ones who would have grabbed a napkin without thinking, and that a man who flinches at his father at 35 will flinch at him at 50. So here is the one thing I'd ask you to actually do today, if any of this landed. Look at the quiet people in your life, the ones who never perform their worth, who show up without announcing it. Tell one of them today that you see what they do. And then sit with this question, honestly. When someone you loved was being diminished in front of you, did you reach for the napkin, or did you do the arithmetic? I want to hear from you. If you think I did the right thing, staying calm, making the calls, letting my daughter choose her own path, comment the number 1. If you think I should have confronted Garrett openly at that table, the way some of you are screaming at your screen right now, comment 2. And if you think I should have stayed out of it entirely and let the chips fall, comment 3. I read these. I'm curious where you land. And tell me, where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are right now? Drop your city. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Most of all, I want to know, Have you ever sat at a table where someone with power looked right through someone you loved? Tell me what you did. Tell me what you wish you'd done. We learn more from each other in these comments than from any story I could ever tell. If this meant something to you, do me a small favor and subscribe. I'm just an old man telling true feeling stories about the quiet kind of strength that the loud world keeps forgetting, and every single subscriber tells me to keep going. I'd be glad to have you here. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Portland, Oregon to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental,